I knew something was wrong before I even got out of my truck. The sound hit me first, a table saw whining somewhere behind the houses, followed by the sharp metallic scream of an angle grinder. Normally, that wouldn't have meant much. People are always building decks, fixing sheds, tearing apart garages in our neighborhood. But I'd been gone for 5 days helping my sister move across state lines. And when you come home after being away, your brain notices little things that usually blend into the background. As I pulled into my driveway that afternoon, I saw a bright orange extension cord stretched across the side yard. Then another. Then another. By the time I walked around the corner of my house, I counted 4 of them. 4 heavy-duty construction-grade cords draped over my fence and plugged directly into the weatherproof outlet mounted on my exterior wall. My outlet. My electricity. My bill. For a second, I just stood there in silence, staring at the setup like maybe there was some perfectly reasonable explanation I hadn't thought of yet. Maybe there had been an emergency. Maybe a transformer blew while I was gone. Maybe somebody from the utility company had approved something. But deep down, I already knew exactly what I was looking at. My neighbor, Greg Holloway, was renovating his garage and had apparently decided my electrical service was now part of his construction budget. The funny thing was Greg and I weren't exactly enemies. We weren't friends either. We were one of those neighbor relationships that live in the uncomfortable middle ground. We'd wave when collecting mail. We'd talk about weather. We'd complain about HOA meetings. But there had always been something about him that rubbed me the wrong way. Greg had this habit of treating every shared space like it belonged to him. He parked too close to property lines, stacked materials where they weren't supposed to be, borrowed things without really asking. Nothing major. Just enough little incidents over the years to make you keep one eye open whenever his name came up. About 2 months before this happened, I'd overheard him complaining at a neighborhood barbecue that contractors were charging too much to run temporary power for his garage conversion project. At the time, I didn't think much of it. Standing there looking at those orange cords, suddenly I thought about that conversation a lot. Instead of marching next door and starting a fight, I walked inside. That's probably the part most people don't expect. I wasn't angry yet. Not really. I was curious. Curiosity can be a dangerous thing because once you start pulling on a thread, sometimes the whole sweater comes apart. I grabbed a bottle of water, sat down at my kitchen table, and pulled out a thick binder I kept for house records. Most people think it's weird. Maybe it is. But my father spent 30 years in commercial construction and always told me one thing. Paperwork wins arguments. Feelings don't. Inside that binder were permits, inspection reports, HOA documents, utility records, and every major piece of paperwork connected to the property. Within 20 minutes, I found exactly what I needed. The outlet had been professionally installed 3 years earlier when I upgraded my outdoor lighting system. It was tied directly into my electrical panel. It was billed exclusively through my account. There was no shared access agreement, no community designation, nothing ambiguous. Then I opened the HOA covenant packet. Buried in Section 14 was a clause regarding structural boundaries and access rights. Any homeowner crossing or utilizing property beyond the fence line required written consent from the owner. Greg hadn't asked. Greg hadn't notified me. Greg hadn't left a note. Greg had simply decided my electricity belonged to him whenever I wasn't home. That should have been enough to make me furious. Instead, it made me suspicious. How long had this been happening? I opened my utility app and started reviewing consumption data. At first, I thought I was imagining things. Then I spotted it. 5 weeks earlier, there was a sudden spike. Then another. Then another. Every weekday morning showed unusually high power consumption during construction hours. The most recent reading nearly made me laugh out loud. $41 in additional electricity usage in a single morning. Not over a month. Not over a billing cycle. One morning, I leaned back in my chair and stared at the screen. The amount wasn't life-changing. $41 wasn't going to bankrupt me. But that wasn't the point anymore. The point was that someone had looked at my property, my electrical system, my monthly bill, and decided none of it mattered because it was convenient for him. That's when I started documenting everything. Every cord, every angle, every connection point. I photographed the setup from my yard, from the side gate, from the upstairs guest room window. I recorded timestamps. I saved utility logs. I built a folder on my laptop. By the 3rd day, I had enough evidence to tell a complete story without saying a single word. And that's when I filed an official complaint with the HOA. Less than an hour later, I received a case number and confirmation that an investigation had been opened. Most people would think that's where the story gets exciting. It wasn't. The exciting part came later, on a hot Thursday afternoon, when I finally walked out to my electrical panel, wrapped my fingers around a single breaker switch, and decided it was time to find out exactly how dependent Greg's renovation project had become on my generosity, even though I'd never agreed to be generous in the first place. The thing about power is that you don't really notice it until it's gone. I stood beside the panel for a second, listening to the noise drifting over the fence. The table saw was running. An air compressor kicked on. Somebody laughed. Somebody dropped a piece of lumber. It sounded less like a garage renovation and more like a professional construction site. Then I flipped the breaker. Just one click. Nothing dramatic. No sparks. No explosions. No movie scene. Just a tiny plastic switch moving from one position to another. But the effect was immediate. The saw stopped in the middle of a cut. The grinder died with a metallic whine. The compressor coughed itself silent. The entire symphony of unauthorized electricity vanished at once. For a few seconds, the neighborhood became strangely quiet. Then I heard voices. Confused voices. Somebody saying, "What happened?" Another guy saying, "Check the extension." Then came footsteps. Fast footsteps. Gravel crunching. A gate swinging open. A minute later, Greg appeared in my driveway looking like he'd just run a marathon. His shirt was covered in sawdust. His face was red from heat and frustration. "Hey, Ethan," he said, trying very hard to sound casual. "Looks like your outlet stopped working." I almost admired the confidence. He wasn't apologizing. He wasn't explaining. He wasn't even pretending he had permission. He was treating the whole situation like a technical inconvenience. I held up my phone and showed him the utility app. "Funny thing," I said. "The outlet works perfectly. My electric bill doesn't." His eyes moved to the screen. I watched him read the numbers. $41. Then another spike. Then another. He stared for a second before letting out a short laugh. "Come on, man. It's just a little power." That sentence changed everything. Not because it was rude. Because it revealed exactly how he viewed the situation. In his mind, this wasn't theft. It wasn't trespassing. It wasn't using someone else's resources without permission. It was just a little power. Just a little convenience. Just a little thing that didn't matter because he wasn't the one paying for it. "A little power?" I asked. "You've been running a construction project for over a month." He shrugged. Actually shrugged. Like we were discussing garden hoses. "I figured we'd settle up later." "Interesting," I said. "When exactly were you planning to mention it?" That was the first question he couldn't answer. Before he could come up with something, I handed him a folder. He looked confused. "What's this?" "Documentation." He opened it. The first page was a simple invoice. $62. Itemized electricity usage. Estimated load calculations. Usage dates. The second page was an access authorization form he should have submitted before crossing onto my property. The third page was a utility agreement outlining conditions for any future use of my electrical service. 30-day notice. Written approval. Monthly access fee. Load restrictions. Liability protection. Greg flipped through the pages slowly. For the first time since entering my driveway, his confidence started slipping. "You made a contract?" he asked. "No," I said. "I prepared one." Before he could respond, another voice came from behind him. His wife, Melissa. She walked through the gate carrying a bottle of water, glanced at the paperwork, then looked directly at her husband. The expression on her face told me something important. She hadn't known. Not all of it, anyway. Maybe she knew he was borrowing power. Maybe she assumed he'd asked permission. But whatever version of the story she'd been given, it clearly didn't match the stack of evidence sitting in his hands. "Greg," she said quietly, "tell me you asked him first." The silence that followed was almost painful. I suddenly realized why he'd been so relaxed for weeks. Nobody had challenged him. Nobody had forced him to explain his decisions out loud. A lot of bad behavior survives because it never gets dragged into daylight. Melissa looked at him again. "Greg." He avoided eye contact. That answered the question. The next few minutes were uncomfortable for everyone involved. He tried minimizing it. He tried calling it a misunderstanding. He tried saying he planned to reimburse me eventually. Every explanation sounded weaker than the one before it. Eventually, Melissa interrupted him. "You used his electricity for over a month and never asked?" Greg sighed. "It's not that simple." "Actually," she replied, "it sounds exactly that simple." After they left, I expected an argument. I expected excuses. Maybe even threats involving lawyers or HOA politics. Instead, the next morning Greg knocked on my door at 8 o'clock sharp. He was holding a check. $62. Exactly the amount listed on the invoice. "I want to take care of this," he said. I looked at the check, but didn't take it immediately. "Which part?" I asked. He gave a tired smile. "All of it." There was something different about him. Less defensive. Less arrogant. Maybe Melissa had spent the evening explaining reality. Maybe seeing everything documented had finally broken through the mental gymnastics. Whatever happened, he seemed genuinely interested in ending the problem. We sat on the front porch for nearly an hour. It was the longest real conversation we'd ever had. And oddly enough, that's when I learned what had been driving the entire mess. The garage project wasn't just a hobby renovation. Greg had recently lost a management position he'd held for almost 12 years. The conversion project was supposed to become a woodworking business. His backup plan, his attempt to avoid dipping into retirement savings while looking for work. Suddenly, some of his decisions made more sense. Not better, not justified, but understandable. He'd been cutting corners because he felt cornered. The problem was that pressure doesn't magically transform bad choices into acceptable ones. If anything, it usually makes consequences more expensive. For a moment, I almost felt bad for him. Then I remembered he never once knocked on my door. Not before the first extension cord. Not after the first utility spike. Not after the second or third or fourth. Every opportunity to handle things honestly had been ignored. We finished talking, and I told him the same thing I'd tell anybody. If you'd asked, I probably would have said yes. He laughed at that. A genuine laugh. "Yeah," he said. "Melissa already pointed that out." For a few weeks things settled down. The cords disappeared. The breaker stayed on. The paperwork sat in a folder. I figured the story was over. I was wrong. Because about 3 weeks later the HOA investigation finally reached its conclusion, and what started as a neighbor quietly borrowing electricity suddenly became something much larger than either of us expected. The board reviewed my evidence, inspected the property line, interviewed both households, and uncovered details that neither Greg nor I had anticipated. By the time they finished, the issue wasn't really about electricity anymore. It was about access rights, liability exposure, insurance violations, and a pattern of behavior that had apparently been bothering other neighbors for years. And when the final notice arrived, it landed like a brick through a window. Greg called me less than 10 minutes after receiving his copy. I could hear the disbelief in his voice before he even finished saying hello. "Ethan," he said, "you need to see this." The strange part was that for the first time since this whole thing began, I wasn't sure whether the outcome would feel like justice or whether things had gone much further than they ever needed to. I walked across the street that evening with the HOA letter still folded in my pocket. The sun was dropping behind the rooftops, throwing long shadows across the neighborhood, and for some reason everything felt quieter than usual. Greg was waiting in his driveway holding his copy of the notice. He didn't look angry. He looked exhausted. The kind of exhausted that comes from realizing a small shortcut has finally reached the end of the road and turned into something much bigger than expected. He handed me the letter without saying a word. I read through it twice. The board had confirmed the unauthorized electrical use, but that wasn't the part that caught their attention. During the inspection, they discovered that contractors working on the garage project had repeatedly crossed onto neighboring properties without written authorization. Temporary materials had been stored outside approved construction boundaries. Extension cords had been routed through common access areas in violation of insurance requirements. More importantly, the HOA's legal advisor determined that if someone had been injured while using electricity supplied through my property, liability could have become an absolute nightmare. Suddenly, the issue wasn't $62. It wasn't even about me anymore. It was about risk. The board issued formal violations, suspended construction approvals until additional inspections were completed, and required Greg to pay for a professional review of the project before work could continue. The total cost was several $1,000s. Not devastating, but definitely painful. Greg leaned against his truck and stared toward his garage. "You know what's funny?" he said. "Every single one of these problems would have disappeared if I'd spent 30 seconds walking across the street and asking a simple question." I couldn't argue with that, because he was right. We stood there for a while watching the evening settle over the neighborhood. No lawyers, no shouting, no dramatic revenge. Just two middle-aged homeowners looking at the consequences of a decision that never should have happened in the first place. A few days later, something unexpected happened. Greg invited several neighbors over for coffee one Saturday morning. Not a party, not a barbecue, more like a public apology disguised as a casual gathering. I almost didn't go. Curiosity got the better of me again. When I arrived, I discovered something interesting. Apparently, I wasn't the only person who had stories. One neighbor talked about borrowed equipment that was never returned. Another mentioned landscaping materials left on her property without permission. Someone else described workers parking in front of his driveway for weeks. None of the incidents were major individually, but together they painted a picture. Greg listened to every complaint. He didn't argue. He didn't defend himself. He just listened. Sometimes that's harder than paying a fine. By the end of the morning, he stood up and said something I'll always remember. I think I got used to treating inconvenience like permission. If something made my life easier and nobody stopped me, I convinced myself it wasn't a problem. The yard went quiet after that, because everybody knew exactly what he meant. The truth is, most neighborhood conflicts don't start with villains. They start with small assumptions. One person assumes a shortcut doesn't matter. Another assumes a favor doesn't require permission. Somebody else assumes they'll explain it later. Then one day those assumptions collide with reality. Construction eventually resumed after the inspections were completed. Everything was done properly. Permits updated. Boundaries respected. Insurance requirements met. And from that point forward, if Greg needed anything, he asked first. Sometimes the answer was yes. Sometimes it was no. But he asked. The funny part is that we actually became better neighbors afterward than we'd ever been before. Not close friends. Not fishing buddies. But honest neighbors. The kind who can have a direct conversation without pretending problems don't exist. Looking back now, years later, I still think about that afternoon when I found those 4 orange extension cords hanging across my fence. At the time, it felt like a story about electricity. Then it felt like a story about property rights. Then it became a story about accountability. But if I'm being fair, it was really a story about respect. Because respect is one of those things people rarely notice when it's present, yet the moment it disappears, everything changes. Sometimes people ask whether I should have skipped the paperwork and just gone straight to the HOA. Others think I was too patient and should have reported him immediately. A few think I should have simply unplugged everything on day one and never said a word. Honestly, I still don't know. What I do know is that the single click of that breaker forced a conversation that should have happened weeks earlier. And maybe that's why the outcome worked. Not because anybody won. Not because anybody lost. But because reality finally entered the room. So now I'm curious what you think. If you came home and discovered your neighbor had been secretly using your electricity for weeks while you were away, would you have handled it the way I did? Would you have shut the power off immediately? Would you have called the HOA first? Or would you have given them a chance to explain before taking action? Let me know down in the comments, because I can already tell people are going to disagree on this one. And if you've ever dealt with a neighbor who treated your property like it belonged to them, share your story too. Don't forget to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and stick around for the next neighborhood conflict story. Because trust me, this wasn't the last time someone in our community learned that shortcuts usually end up costing more than doing things right the first time.